Welcome everyone to the spring webinar series, The Long Civil Rights Movement. For those of you who haven't made it to one of the other two yet, I'm Dave Johnson, currently serving as past president of MCSS, as well as the Online Learning Committee Chair. I'm very excited for tonight's presentation. Tonight is part 3 of a 4-part series. And if you've registered for this one, you should consider coming back to the exciting conclusion of the whole thing on Wednesday, when we wrap things up with 2 master teachers talking about their experiences teaching the movement in their history classes. As many of you know, events streaming from the summer of 2020, most particularly the murder of George Floyd, resulted in one of the first organizational statements that MCSS has put out in many, many years. We promised to use our collaborative voice to make positive changes in education and our local communities. And tonight's discussion and presentation is just one of the many steps we've taken down this path. Tonight we'll be guided by Dr. Michael Butler from Flagler College in Florida, and I will introduce him in just a moment. But first, all of the usual housekeeping things. All of the stuff on this slide is what's going on with MCSS. The Michigan Council for the Social Studies is a nonprofit organization staffed entirely by volunteers. Our tagline, Tomorrow's Leaders Learn Today, basically suggests that the teachers across this great state are the ones preparing our current students for their future. Whether you're a current member or not, we hope you'll consider joining or renewing your membership with us as we seek to partner with and support you in this endeavor. For $40 a year, you gain access to everything you see here: webinar series, recaps to webinar series like the one that you'll have access to after this is over. The MCSS Toolbox, the publication just for members that contains tips and strategies for teaching social studies. We run an annual Olympiad for students, which is an amazing opportunity to showcase the great things your students are doing in class. You'll receive 2 issues of the Great Lakes Social Studies Journal each year. This is a brand new peer-reviewed journal. It launched last fall, or fall of 2020. And it contains articles on theory and practice. You'll receive a discounted rate to our annual conference, which is currently slated to be back in person next year in beautiful Traverse City. You'll be able to be a part of additional training opportunities like the one we wrapped up with the Library of Congress on teaching with and of course, your membership provides advocacy. Pictured here is former President Annie Whitlock at the Capitol meeting with legislators about the important work that you do in your classroom. We are a thriving organization, and we hope you'll consider joining or renewing today. But now away from the boring stuff and into the good stuff. With that out of the way, it's time to get down to business. Dr. J. Michael Butler is our speaker tonight. He is a keen and distinguished professor of history at Flagler College, where he has taught since 2008. His work has appeared in many leading peer-reviewed academic publications, such as the Journal of American Studies, the Journal of Southern History, the Florida Historical Quarterly, and Southern Cultures. His book, Beyond Integration, The Black Freedom Struggle in Escambia County, Florida, 1860 through 1980, won a 2017 Florida Book Award in nonfiction. Dr. Butler specializes in Southern cultural history with an emphasis on the civil rights movement, and he teaches a number of classes on the topic and has served as the lead scholar in multiple teacher training seminars related to the civil rights movement. His current project is an examination of Black popular cultural production between 1965 and 1980. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to you, Dr. Butler. Welcome once again, and thank you for being here again to close the series.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dave. I think that you've got that introduction memorized by now, being as that it's like, what, the 3rd time that you've given it. So yeah, I'm as Minnie Pearl would say, I'm just so glad to be here once again, to sort of give the wrap up of really where the rubber hits the road with the civil rights movement and its importance today. I didn't mention it last week because we were just getting to know each other, but it seems that in some places like my state, Florida, politicians are more worried about the teaching of uncomfortable racial histories than they are actually acknowledging its ramifications. And there is a correlation between a lack of historical understanding on the history of racism and its consequences in this country and shootings like the one that happened at Tops Market in Buffalo. I mean, if that doesn't remind us what the stakes are, when you can have students who come through your classroom maybe getting invested in an internet rabbit hole and buying into this idea of white replacement theory, which, by the way, is the very same thing Adolf Hitler was writing about in Mein Kampf, then we have neglected our calling, our duty as history educators, right? We talk about uncomfortable topics, not for the purpose of making students uncomfortable, but in trying to educate them on how the past continues to inform the present. That's the important, and that's why these topics are so crucial. There are very few historical topics, and I know now I've gotten my high horse and I've put it on top of my soapbox, but bear with me. There are very few historical topics that have contemporary relevance to the degree that this topic does, the civil rights movement. And today what we're going to talk about are sort of the moving targets of discrimination and the legacies that are still with us, with voting disqualification, voter disenfranchisement, with police brutality, with the presence of Confederate images in public spaces, right? So, you know, maybe the timing was perfect, maybe the timing was terrible, but to be reminded of the importance of these topics in our classrooms with easily impressionable young people who have access to all sorts of misinformation that is shared with people who are not good faith actors. How do we combat that? I hope that programs like this are one step, one small step, and maybe helping us expose people, expose students, topics that are not comfortable, but yet remain relevant. So with that in mind, I'll get off my high horse, which is on top of my soapbox, and go into the movement continued. Now, when we left off last lecture, I decided to end it with the signing of the Civil Rights Act, right? The signing of the Civil Rights Act in one fell swoop with one signature eliminated Jim Crow laws. And that's what we've set up the movement to be about. How do you combat legalized, institutionalized racial injustice? Well, so far, you target the laws, you change the laws. But one of the things that I wanted to emphasize is just like Brown, right? Just like every topic that we can cover in this seminar, there is no one silver bullet that eliminates racism and the historical impact that years of racism have had, right? For every step forward, there seems to be a step backward when it comes to racial progress in this country. And the place where we see the battleground continuously being fought is with the vote. Now, the Civil Rights Act ended discriminatory practices by law in places of public accommodation. There are some places, though, like Mississippi, that are not urban, that have issues elsewhere, just like all communities did not have school systems that were inherently unequal, at least in terms of the money that were being spent on the upkeep of those schools, right? In Mississippi, the only place really where the campaign against segregated lunch counters took root was Jackson, the capital. In places like Mississippi, the real problem was the lack of voter registration. We have counties in Mississippi in 1964 where the population is 93% Black and fewer than 1% of registered voters are Black, right? It's the vote that mattered in a place like Mississippi. And there are organizations and there are individuals like Bob Moses who targeted Mississippi for voter registration campaigns. Because in an area like Mississippi, where overall the state population is just over 50-50 African American, the power of the vote is the power to enact change, meaningful change, Mississippi had not had a Black lieutenant governor since Reconstruction. Mississippi has not had a Black senator since the period of Reconstruction, even though a majority of its citizens, roughly a majority, a small majority, but a majority, are African American. So campaigns like Freedom Summer were organized to register African American voters in rural areas in Mississippi. Now, Mississippi, Freedom Summer is the culmination of voting activities that had been going on for quite some time, right? And one of the things that Bob Moses planned in the organization that he formed to sort of unite all the organizations in Mississippi was to depend upon college students in northern private schools to come south for summer 1964 to register as many African Americans as possible. The campaign was called Freedom Summer. And the idea was that Black people had been dying for the right to vote for years in Mississippi. And very few people paid attention outside of the state. The idea was kind of cynical, but it's true that if we had white college students from influential elite families who dedicated their summer to coming to Mississippi, that would give some cover. Surely they would be more safe than the African American and few whites who had been doing this work in Mississippi before the summer of 1964. So the campaign was called Freedom Summer, and it revitalized the Mississippi Klan. Mississippi, as one documentary put it, was preparing as if they were about to be invaded by Mongol hordes because it was such a direct threat to the way of life, quote unquote, in the Magnolia State. Well, on June 21st, 1964, the unthinkable happened. These three individuals, Michael Schwerner from Brooklyn. Schwerner was a regional organizer in the Meridian area. Andrew Goodman on his first day in Mississippi. And James Chaney, a local registrar from Meridian, went missing. It launched the biggest manhunt, and it remains the biggest manhunt to this day in FBI history. The name of the case was codenamed Mississippi Burning. What Mississippi Burning does, the case, is focus international attention to the fact that the Civil Rights Act did not address all wrongs in the South. It did not result in equality across the board. In fact, it was extremely limited when it came to protecting the right of African Americans to register to vote. When, for the longest period of time, poll taxes, understanding clauses, literacy clauses kept them off the rolls. When there was a national campaign to increase voter registration, the most fundamental of all American rights, two whites and an African American from Mississippi go missing. Their bodies were discovered in early August 1964. They had been murdered. We now know the details of what happened to Schwerner, Chaney, and Goodman. It was a setup between the White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan in Mississippi and the Sheriff's Department in Neshoba County. Schwerner, Chaney, and Goodman died for the right for Black people in Mississippi to vote. What this does is regalvanize the movement. Remember, the Civil Rights Act is signed on July 2nd, 1964, and it should have been a period of tremendous celebration, and to a degree it was, but when LBJ signed that act into law, Schwerner, Chaney, and Goodman were still missing. what the nation now needed, according to SCLC and groups like it that were already working in the South, like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, what the organization wanted to now do was to have a campaign that made a federal voting rights act the end result. Just like Birmingham resulted in the passage of the Civil Rights Act with an assist from St. Augustine, right? I have to say that, living in this city. King and other civil rights organizations were looking for a campaign to demand the right to register and vote without intimidation. And the campaign that they emphasized, where they were called, was Selma, Alabama. January 1965. Selma, Alabama was a local voting rights campaign that had been ongoing for some time in and around these counties, in Lowndes County, Alabama, and Dallas County, Alabama. And there were your typical marches, nonviolent protests, and the state of Alabama was second only to Mississippi in the way that it confronted these civil rights groups. Long story short, it was the murder of a young man by an Alabama state trooper. The young man's name was Jimmy Lee Jackson. Again, another example of how many of the people who gave everything for the basic constitutional freedoms for all Americans name never make the textbooks, right? Jimmy Lee Jackson was killed by an Alabama state trooper as he was trying to shield his grandmother from being beaten. He was shot in the back of the head. No one has ever been prosecuted for that. It focused attention on the problem of voter discrimination in places like Alabama in the aftermath immediately upon Freedom Summer and the consequences that came from it at the Democratic National Convention in 1964. So the plan was, in March of 1965, in order to raise awareness for the need for a voters' rights amendment, very much like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, SCLC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and other civil rights organizations that were in Selma, Alabama, organized what they called the Selma to Montgomery March. They were literally going to take their plea to the state capitol steps. The person who was the governor of Alabama at the time is straight out of central casting as the quintessential racist Southern governor. His name was George Wallace. George Corley Wallace. When he gave his inaugural address after being elected governor, his inaugural address was 1963. He gave one of the most infamous public speeches of any elected official in American history, where he said, "I throw down the gauntlet before tyranny now and state segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." That was his introduction to American politics, right? And he said, as the planning for the Selma to Montgomery March happened, that he would not allow the state roads be used for civil rights demonstrations. So, March 7, 1965, the state police, highway patrol, county, and city officers were called to block the bridge that led out of Selma on the highway to Montgomery. It was the Edmund Pettus Bridge, Pettus, and it is now a shrine in the American civil rights movement, in American history as a whole, I believe. One of the people who was at the front of the line was John Lewis, former representative from the state of Georgia. Another was Andrew Young, representative of SCLC, also out of Georgia. And the deal was because SCLC had filed a lawsuit stating that the governor of Alabama unconstitutionally blocked access to the highways, that they were going to save face. They were going to lead 300 people across the bridge, encounter the state troopers, ask to pray, and then turn around and go back over the bridge. But that's not what happened. The state troopers, after the mob was told, after the crowd was told, the assembled protesters were told that you can pray and you have a minute to turn around, less than 15 seconds in, the state troopers, many of whom were on horseback, all of whom were in riot gear, began to shoot tear gas into the crowd, waded into the protesters, most of whom were adult age, if not elderly, swinging police batons, using electrified cattle prods and bullwhips against those who were trying to pray for the right to one day vote in the state of Alabama. Look, in all of these campaigns, one of the key elements is to publicize the demands in hopes for a resolution to the issue. So national media is present, and they caught in real time an event that became known as Bloody Sunday. This is the infamous photograph of the state trooper bringing down the club over the head of John Lewis, fractured his skull, hospitalized him, almost killed him, right? So Bloody Sunday, Reverend King was not there. He came later that day and said that the march would continue. The ministers' march then, with President Johnson that night going on television in an emergency session of Congress and pledging his support for a Voting Rights Act. And he made the, it's a famous, famous speech. This will be another great primary source to show to your classes, because President Johnson, when outlining his support for a federal Voting Rights Act, closed by saying, because it is all of us who must overcome the legacies of racism, and we shall overcome. He used the language and the rhetoric of the movement freedom song itself in his address to Congress. Andrew Young said that was the only time in his life he ever saw Dr. King cry. See, they were saying, there were many who said the Civil Rights Act is too much too fast, that maybe SCLC, maybe some of these groups needed to cool their heels a little bit because they got the Civil Rights Act, and that was a big deal. But instead, activists, organizations, college students, adults said no. Justice delayed is justice denied. And they persisted with the demand for the vote. And they get it with the passage of the Voting Rights Act, which was signed into law by President Johnson on August 6, 1965. The Voting Rights Act. What the Voting Rights Act basically did was outlaw all literacy tests, poll taxes, any sort of qualifying standard placed on the right to register to vote. Not only that, but in states where, states and counties where there was a history of voter intimidation, federal marshals could be sent in to patrol the elections. The other thing that happened is that all elections were now based on federal law. So a good thing to tell your students is that, you know, the grandma and grandpa that are often at the voting booths, the poll watchers, as they're called, they are federal employees. And they are there because of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and any crimes committed in an attempt to fraudulently vote or deprive another person of their vote is a federal crime. Okay? Because the best way to confront misinformation is with fact. Over 80 federal court cases, over 80. At the last count, it was up to 83. 83 federal cases alleging fraud in the 2020 presidential election have been dismissed by federal justices. This is a serious act. Voter disqualification, intimidation, or fraud is a federal crime thanks to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now, President Johnson was nothing if not self-aware. And there's a story, I think it might be apocryphal, but one of the reasons that Johnson was so hesitant, maybe, to get involved in the civil rights struggle in America more than he did was fear that the Democratic South would leave the party. And the story goes that as Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act, he turned to his speechwriter, a man by the name of Bill Moyers, and said that I just lost the South for a generation. I think he underestimated. Now with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, you've got the twin pillars of civil rights legislation in this country. It's mission accomplished, right? So racism's dead. Not necessarily. The very same month that the Voting Rights Act is signed into law, the largest urban uprising in American history occurred, at least until 1992 with the Rodney King riots. There's a lot of controversy about the words we use. Is Watts a riot? Is it an uprising? Is it a revolution? I tend to go with uprising because, as Dr. King later said, the urban riot is the language of the unheard. August 11 to August 16, 1965, just days after the Voting Rights Act is signed into law, the nation was made aware that laws don't change everything. Watts is a poor, predominantly African-American suburb of Los Angeles. In Watts, the resentments against institutionalized effects of segregation by practice, not segregation by law, had enveloped the community. Rent prices, sky high. Access to jobs, unavailable. School funding, very, very uneven. But the biggest problem that existed in Watts was the fact that the LAPD discriminated against Black motorists with no punishment, with no threat of ever being held accountable. Look, one of the things that happened is as the population of LA began to grow in the 40s and 50s after World War II, true story, police commissioner in LA said that to police, quote unquote, these people, these number of migrants that are coming in who aren't white, we need to go to the place that knows how to control the minorities. We need to go to the South. Places like LA recruited police from the Jim Crow South, and they wanted white people, and they do. And they bring their prejudices with them. And what the Watts riot basically was sparked by the beating of a Black motorist by LAPD. It is not incident that started the uprising. It was the latest in a series of local outrages that fueled the desperate act of literally destroying the neighborhood. 35,000 people participated in the Watts uprising. At least 34 people died, 4,000 arrests. The National Guard had to be sent in to stop the rioting. $40 million worth of property damage done. One of the things that often happens in instances like this is that people ask, why are minorities destroying their own neighborhoods? And that sort of misses the point. Black residents did not consider this to be their neighborhoods. They were not allowed to buy property. They didn't have access to bank loans. They didn't have jobs. The shops that were owned by people who invested, charged outrageous prices for goods, and as the residents claim, victimized people who are already poor. In other words, there are many reasons to try to understand that we can use to understand why something like Watts would occur. But the bottom line is, particularly for students, I use Watts to demonstrate that the same month, literally a week later, after the Voting Rights Act is signed, there is a national reminder that laws are limited. What this introduces is that there is a fundamental difference in the civil rights movement in changing laws that discriminate against people and addressing practices that perpetuate second-class citizenship. Police brutality, economic, financial discrimination, unemployment, inadequate schools, residential segregation, all of these things were not addressed by legal changes. As a matter of fact, you can make the argument that those de facto forms of segregation intensify as de jure forms of integration occur. De jure is segregation by law. That's easy. In real time, this is shocking, right? Lyndon Johnson didn't know what to make of this. I thought we were making progress, and then Watts happens. King and the traditional civil rights movement didn't understand Watts. Dr. King went to Watts, and he was publicly jeered. He was booed. He was called an Uncle Tom. He was told to go down south. And if you see footage of King's appearances in Watts, he is shaken. He has never seen the desperation and the anger from the disenfranchised until he went to a place like Watts. Laws don't change second-class citizenship status. That was the message of Watts. And oh, by the way, between 1964 and 1968, there are approximately 300 what are classified as urban riots in American cities. 300 between 1964 and 1968. Well, this led SCLC King to wonder if nonviolence could work outside of the South. Can we take the victories of the movement? Can we take nonviolence, community, grassroots activism, places where it worked like Montgomery and Birmingham, and to a degree Selma? Can we take those nonviolent direct action campaigns to the North to combat things like inadequate housing? That's what the Chicago campaign was about, right? Whether or not the movement could be addressed outside of the South using the same sort of tactics. One of the things that occurred is that King and SCLC officials moved to what is called a slum area in Chicago in January of 1960. He understood that the national media would cover the lack of heating, the dilapidated surroundings, the insect infestations, right? The lack of utilities. And you can see from this photograph, in an urban setting, King using a very familiar and very traditional type of community organizing. He's given a sermon. What he realized, particularly as they began to look at residential patterns of segregation, is that the racism that existed across the United States as a result of places like Los Angeles and Chicago, Detroit, that the racism that existed in the North was much different than the kind of racism that existed in the South. I mean, he ran into a nemesis. He ran into someone who knew how to address his charges with Mayor Richard Daley in Chicago, right? You've got, something that I stuck around and talked with a couple of people about on Wednesday. You've got the rise of Black nationalists. You've got the rise of, by this time, he's assassinated, but Black Power, Malcolm X. You're going to have this year the formation of the Black Panthers. This is all really, really important in terms of putting the movement at a literal crossroads. The whole movement now has started to shift. It started to change. And the place where much of the problem rested, according to Dr. King, was with poverty. That it was poverty that caused the racial unrest that he encountered outside of the South. That it was poverty in the South that was also the root of segregation. You see, before, the idea kind of was that maybe it was racism that created, the legacies of racism created poverty. But that's not the way that it actually ended up. It is a huge awakening for King and the traditional movement to understand that no, the laws being changed was the easy part. But now the hard work begins of how do we address these deep-seated racial inequities that have characterized whites and Blacks and other minorities across the nation. It's kind of remarkable to think that the last book that Dr. King ever wrote, well, he wrote it after Chicago, right? The title is Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? Where do we go from here, chaos or community? It was out of print for a time in the United States. It's often not discussed when we think about the civil rights movement and the legacy of the struggle. But it's all too relevant today, right? And he basically calls upon the federal government to put its money where its values are and invest in cities, invest in schools, invest in people, right? It is a fundamental reorientation of the civil rights movement that happened during King's lifetime. Now, again, I want to emphasize the fact that the movement is not King alone. However, for your students, I think it's really valuable to trace the evolution of the movement, its ebbs, its flows, its changes through the experiences of someone that they can relate to, right? King and SCLC are convenient. They're relatable. There's other things going on. There's the March Against Fear in Mississippi. There is Stokely Carmichael. There's the rise of the Black Panthers. There's Fred Hampton, who's later going to be called by the FBI the Black Messiah. There's a lot of things going on, but you have the embodiment of these fractures and these frustrations and these changes in Dr. King and the way that he experienced the perpetuation of racism outside of the South after 1965. I personally think this period of King's life is more important, more impactful, and more relevant, the 65 to 68, than possibly even before, because the movement was building toward legal change. Our nation has yet to come to grips with the impact of years of segregation, and that's what he was beginning to encounter and experience. So if poverty, if helplessness, if hopelessness are all things that were embedded in the American system, how did you change it? Well, the last major campaign that SCLC organized during King's life was called the Poor People's Campaign. The Poor People's Campaign is absolutely fascinating. It revealed that his own organization was torn on what the Poor People's Campaign would look like. The Poor People's Campaign was planned in 1967, and it was to take place in 1968. Basically, what the Poor People's Campaign was building toward was a Poor People's March on Washington for June of 1968. It was to be like the March on Washington of 1963, except instead of a celebration of nonviolence and the Civil Rights Act being promised, it would be to demand a Poor People's Bill of Rights, right? But the first step toward eliminating injustice would be a guaranteed national annual income. It would bring poor people from all over the nation, all races, Hispanic, Black, white, Asian, didn't matter, that everyone would converge on Washington for this and demand that the government spend the necessary funds on social programs to help eliminate the inequities that had become sort of baked in the cake. There's a great quote that Dr. King used during this time, and it actually came from Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? And it was, how do you expect a man to pull himself up by his bootstraps when he doesn't even own a pair of boots? That's the economic component. Well, I've said all that to say that the place where the economic inequities were most apparent surfaced during a sanitation worker strike in Memphis, Tennessee. Now, look, I'm leaving out so much, but this is fascinating because one of the things that King did a year before his death, exactly a year before his death, was that on April 4, 1967, he gave his famous Riverside sermon in New York City, where he publicly denounced the war in Vietnam. When he denounced the war in Vietnam, and he made it about the money our government was spending on the campaign, which took away from the social programs that were so desperately needed. When he said, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world is my own government, that made him public enemy number one. This was why LBJ felt betrayed and totally shut King out. This is why he allowed J. Edgar Hoover to harass and hound Dr. King in the last years of his life. So there's a lot going on here that complexifies and I think humanizes the struggle for racial equality in America. And King embodied it. He lived through it. Memphis, Tennessee, 1968. 2 sanitation workers who worked Sanitation workers as a whole averaged over 80 hours a week in some of the most deplorable conditions that you can imagine. They don't get lunch breaks. They don't get bonuses. They don't get overtime. They don't even get insurance. 2 sanitation workers are killed in the back of a garbage truck in which they were trying to seek shelter during a storm. Faulty equipment killed these 2 men, and their families didn't even have enough money to bury them. The sanitation workers went on strike, and their slogan was as effective as it was simple: I am a man. As it often happened, sanitation workers wanted to nationally publicize their campaign, so they asked Dr. King to come to Memphis. Most SCLC members, officers said, don't go. We've got to plan for the Poor People's Campaign. We don't even know what we're really doing here. We don't know how we're going to pull it off. King, though, said, this is what the Poor People's Campaign is about. Dignity, a living wage, economic injustice. So he goes to Memphis, leads a march, brings national attention to this problem. And that's why he is at the Lorraine Motel on the evening of April 4, 1968, when he's assassinated. This is the event that in the master narrative, the movement ends. The assassination of King is the point at which the civil rights movement, the master narrative from 1954 to 1968, really closes. And that's unfortunate. When you die in the middle of your life's peak, King was just 39 years old. We forget that. He was a relatively young man. The coroner said he had the heart of a 75-year-old from all the stress that he had lived with. But the movement doesn't end. King himself was in the final stages of trying to come to grips of where the movement would go next. And you know, that's one of the most important things that I wanted to stress to y'all, and I stress to my students, is that just because King is assassinated doesn't mean the movement ends. It doesn't. It may have lost its symbolic figurehead, someone who didn't want that crown on his head, someone who struggled with his own personal inadequacies his entire life. But he was at the absolute bottom of his popularity because the movement was changing, and he wasn't sure how to change with it. I don't think we as a nation still understand how to change with it. And these are the questions that I asked when I started thinking about my own dissertation and what I wanted to contribute to this understanding of the movement big picture. What happened in certain communities after the 1960s ended? And it kind of gives a way for me to wrap up, to put a cap on the importance of the things that we've discussed. In many communities, in every community, particularly in the South, where you had discriminatory laws, every community had to integrate. Every community schools had to meet federal standards in order to have funds matched that the state had invested, right? Some communities, like the one that I studied in Northwest Florida, had a relatively peaceful, atypical movement during the 1960s. But in the 1970s, in Pensacola, I think that it served as a microcosm for the nation as a whole. It's 1974, 1975. And my own research in Pensacola demonstrated that there were 2 issues that became civil rights issues. that Black students and Black people said were civil rights issues. And people in positions of authority pushed back and said, these aren't civil rights issues. The civil rights movement's over. We've achieved equality with laws. And those issues in Pensacola were, first and foremost, the accusations of murder that white police officers could use against Black motorists. In 1974, an African-American motorist named Wendell Blackwell, under very, very questionable evidence from the people who were present, was shot from a 3-foot range in the head by a police officer who claimed he had a gun. It was the latest in a series of similar events that had happened in this city. The accusations of police brutality and public servants not caring about the lives of Black people galvanized the community. It also sparked a backlash. In Pensacola, Florida, the Ku Klux Klan hatched a plan to use Black angst and protest in Pensacola as a way to revitalize the national organization. The Ku Klux Klan looked at Pensacola and said, we can use these Black troublemakers, these agitators, these complainers to start a national resurgence. White backlash to Black people saying, please stop killing us. The other issue that divided Pensacola was the presence of Confederate imagery in public high schools. Escambia County High School was the largest and the least integrated high school in Escambia County. Busing, rural whites, urban Blacks, to a school where whites used Confederate imagery to basically mark their territory, to say that our school is the rebels, our mascot is Johnny Reb, our band plays Dixie, and there's not a damn thing you can do to stop it. In other words, there are examples after examples after examples of white students using these Confederate imageries to let Black people know they weren't welcome. A federal judge determined that this violated the spirit of Brown. And when a federal order took the Confederate images out of the school, it resulted in 3 days of rioting. Why do I talk about this? Why do I go into the 1970s struggle, into the 1980s, even the 1990s? It's because the very same issues that are dividing this city 40 years ago are issues that we still deal with today. Confederate images in places of public accommodation. What does it mean to have a statue in the middle of our public squares? Police brutality, nonviolent protests. Why does this matter? What does it mean? How is this rooted in history? How does the past inform the present? You don't have to take a side, but you can understand that this is within the tradition of contemporary nonviolent protest that links the past and the present. It's really interesting that Dave began by saying this was a program that we started based on a decision that we made in the aftermath of the George Floyd murder. The thing that I heard from a lot of people who I respect is that the George Floyd murder has been happening for years. And I thought of Wendell Blackwell. And I thought about people in Pensacola who I got to know during the research. And the only difference between George Floyd and Wendell Blackwell, Emmett Till, all of the things that we've discussed in this lecture is that we got to witness George Floyd narrate his own death for over 8 minutes. And that's what it took for us to realize that Black Lives Matter was a plea, not a demand. That it fits into the patterns of America's difficult, uncomfortable racial history. The importance here is that it demonstrates the relevance and importance of historical understanding. If we don't understand the past, one of the things that I hate, guys, is when people say history repeats itself. It doesn't. But we used a Mark Twain quote earlier in the first lecture to talk about the United States of Lyncherdom. Mark Twain also had a quote concerning history. History may not repeat itself, but it does indeed rhyme. We can't understand the rhythms of American history unless we understand this difficult topic that we have yet to come to grips with. In my opinion, is that one of the reasons we haven't come to grips with its impact is because we haven't had an honest discussion about what has happened in the past. And if we don't understand what happened in the past, we don't understand what the movement was about. It is the most quintessential American topic. How, in this country, due to features that individuals had absolutely no control over, they were denied constitutional rights by law, yet worked within the system to make America fulfill its promises equally to everyone. That's the importance of the movement. It demonstrates that, one, history matters, and it matters in real and visceral ways that still impact us today. That two, if we don't come to grips with this history, we're not going to understand where the nature of white backlash is. For every step forward in racial progress that we've made, there has been 3 or 4 steps backwards that we've taken. Finally, what is the purpose of history? I think that's a valid question to ask. In our state, it's to reinforce narratives of exceptionalism and comfort. If history is meant to make you feel comfortable about your worldviews, your teacher did it wrong. We can't understand how the past continues to influence the present until we address topics that should be uncomfortable, but are chronological, topical, and dominated by the evidence we share with our students. You know, I want to take a glass half full approach. And the thing about this topic is that it demonstrates that the system can be used to self-correct. That when citizens hold up a mirror to who we think we are as a country, there is room for improvement, that there is room for growth. So if we have to take anything out of this, it's the fact that democracy can be used to right wrongs that are committed against our own citizens. So with that in mind, I'll turn it over to Dave. Maybe we have time for questions. Probably not. But once again, thank you so much for all of your attention and for coming to these and, you know, opening yourself up to learning about topics that aren't the most uplifting and can be uncomfortable, particularly in a time where final grades and final exams are rapidly approaching. So thank you for the opportunity, Dave. I appreciate the opportunity that MCSS has given me, and I hope that this is not a one-off. I would love the opportunity to meet all of you one day and talk about these important subjects once again in another forum that is hopefully productive and beneficial to all involved. So thank you once again.
Virtual round of applause for Dr. Butler, everybody. This was absolutely fantastic. Anyone who's interested, I will someday tell you the story of how he and I connected via Twitter, but I'm super glad that we were able to bring you in for this. I'm super confident that we can probably find some ways to bring you in again in the future, because this is not a conversation that we're done having any sense of the word. But are there any questions out there for Dr. Butler?
Wow, no questions. That's pretty good.
If they're anything like me, they're probably still processing a couple of your final closing statements there. There's one in particular about history and the comfort level, and we're not doing it right if we're comfortable. That I'm totally butchering right now, but I can see that on a bumper sticker. Like it's perfect. It sums it up immediately, perfectly.
What are we told? Bleep your feelings. History says bleep your feelings. History does not care about how you feel about the past. It is, as we say, what it is. But no, I think one of the important things to demonstrate to people who approach these topics with a little bit of hesitancy or maybe with a little bit of anger is it's a process. Education and learning is a process. I learn just as much from my students every time I teach a topic that they do. Now, I don't have all the answers, but I do know where to go to begin putting those answers together. So my approach with my students, and I think that they buy this, we are learning together and we're having difficult conversations based on primary source, evidence-driven narratives. Once you do that, then maybe people will be a little more open than we thought they would be.
You're here.
So thank you once again, Dave. We'll have to tell that story again. And this is the dangerous set of lectures that Osceola County basically banned because of fears that critical race theory were being propagated. So you've all been adequately indoctrinated. My work here is done.
Well, Dr. Butler, on behalf of the Michigan Council for Social Studies, I want to thank you again, and everyone who attended. Information on how to view the recaps will be sent out over the next couple of days, as will the sketch form. You only need to fill it out once, I believe, for all of the sessions that you attended, and we can do the rest from there. But everybody, thank you. We hope to see you here for our exciting conclusion on Wednesday, and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you so much, guys.